The man known to the British underworld as Brown Bread Fred was born on the 5th of March 1932 as Frederick Gerald Foreman at 22 Sheepcote Lane in the district of Battersea in South London, England. His father was Herbert Edward Foreman, an Irishman who worked as a labourer in the industrial heart of South London to support his family through the economic hardships of the early 1930s. The household was crowded, with Freddie sharing a small bedroom with 4 of his brothers in the terraced 2-up, 2-down house, which stood near the Flag pub in Battersea. The Foreman family lived in conditions typical of working-class South London households during the interwar period, in a neighbourhood where poverty was endemic and opportunities were scarce. The cramped living quarters at Sheepcote Lane reflected the broader economic circumstances which prevailed across Britain's industrial cities in the aftermath of the Great Depression, a period when families such as the Foremans struggled daily to make ends meet. Although he was born in Battersea, Freddie would remain in South London throughout his formative years, growing up in an environment which would prove instrumental in shaping his future path. It is worth reflecting on the development of South London and its criminal underworld during this period, with which Freddie would become so intrinsically associated. South London had developed from a collection of small villages in the early 19th century into a sprawling industrial centre by the time of Freddie's birth. The area south of the Thames River had been largely rural until the Victorian era, when the expansion of London's docklands and the construction of railway networks transformed Battersea, Bermondsey, and the surrounding districts into densely populated working-class neighbourhoods. The site was developed rapidly through the 1880s and 1890s as factories, warehouses, and terraced housing were constructed to accommodate the influx of workers required by London's expanding industrial economy. As Britain developed economically in the late 19th century and early 20th century, so too did South London. The population of Battersea increased from some 100,000 people in 1890 to over 160,000 by the time of the First World War, driven by the district's development as a centre of manufacturing and trade. And this growth continued through the interwar period. By the time Freddie was born in 1932, Battersea and the wider South London area had become one of the most densely populated working-class regions in Britain, home to over 500,000 people living in often overcrowded and impoverished conditions. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 brought devastation to South London as German bombing campaigns targeted the area's docks, factories, and railway yards. The Blitz between 1940 and 1941 resulted in widespread destruction across Battersea, with thousands of homes destroyed and entire streets reduced to rubble. Freddie and countless other children from the area were evacuated to the countryside, though many, including Freddie, returned to London before the worst of the bombing had ended. In the aftermath of the war, South London faced severe economic hardship. Rationing continued well into the 1950s. Unemployment was high, and the destruction of housing stock left many families living in damaged or temporary accommodation. It was in this environment of post-war deprivation and social dislocation that black market operations and organized criminal networks began to flourish, offering opportunities for those willing to operate outside the law. By the time he was in his later teens, Freddie had already become involved in the criminal enterprises which had sprung up across South London in the aftermath of the war. The experience of evacuation and the trauma of the Blitz had left a lasting impact on the young Foreman, and like many boys of his generation who had witnessed the destruction of their neighborhoods and the breakdown of social order, he found himself drawn towards the opportunities which existed on the fringes of legality. Freddie left school at the age of 14 with little in the way of formal education, and soon after he was involved in various acts of petty crime in the streets around Battersea. The specific details of Freddie's early criminal activities are difficult to verify with complete accuracy. Certain versions of events have him involved in street fights and theft from local shops and warehouses, while others suggest he was running errands for established criminals in the area who were profiting from the black market trade in rationed goods. What is certain is that by the age of 16, Freddie found himself on trial at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court, marking his first encounter with the British justice system. The charges and outcome of this trial are not entirely clear from available records, but it established a pattern which would define much of Freddie's adult life. And these early brushes with the law did not deter him. Instead, Freddie continued to build a reputation in the neighborhoods of South London as someone willing to use violence when necessary, and someone who could be relied upon by those operating outside the boundaries of the law. By the early 1950s, he had moved beyond petty theft and was establishing connections with more organized criminal operations. The subsequent career of Freddie Foreman has to be considered in light of the history of British organized crime in the 20th century and the development of London's criminal underworld. In some senses, crime and politics cannot be disentangled in 20th century Britain, particularly in the capital city of London, where organized criminal activity had been developing since the Victorian era. The roots of modern British organized crime can be traced to the racecourse gangs of the 1920s and 1930s, violent groups which controlled illegal betting operations at horse racing tracks across the country. These gangs fought territorial battles for control of the lucrative gambling trade, often using razors and other weapons to intimidate rivals and enforce their dominance over specific racecourses and betting pitches. By the 1930s, several criminal organizations had established themselves in London, most notably the Sabini gang, led by Darby Sabini, an Italian-British criminal who controlled much of the racecourse protection racket in southern England. The Sabini organization operated primarily from Clerkenwell in central London and had established a sophisticated structure which prefigured the organized crime firms of later decades. However, the outbreak of the Second World War disrupted these operations, as many gang members were either conscripted into military service or, in the case of those with Italian heritage, interned as enemy aliens. The post-war period saw the emergence of new criminal figures who would dominate London's underworld for the next 2 decades. Billy Hill, born in 1911 in Seven Dials in central London, had been involved in crime since his youth, and by the late 1940s had established himself as one of the most successful criminals in Britain. Hill specialized in sophisticated robberies, including the famous East Castle Street postal van robbery in May 1952, in which over £250,000 in cash was stolen, an enormous sum equivalent to several £1 million in modern currency. Hill operated what became known as a firm, a criminal organization with a hierarchical structure and defined roles for its members, and his operations extended across London and beyond. Another prominent figure during this period was Jack Spot Comer, known as Jack Spot, who had emerged from the East End of London and competed with Hill for dominance over the capital's criminal operations. Throughout the early 1950s, Hill and Spot alternated between cooperation and conflict, with their rivalry occasionally erupting into violence. By the mid-1950s, Hill had largely retired from active criminal operations, though he remained an influential figure in London's underworld, while Spot's influence had waned following a violent assault upon him in 1956. The criminal landscape of London during this period was defined by strict territorial boundaries. The East End centred on districts such as Whitechapel, Bethnal Green, and Mile End, was traditionally the domain of Jewish and later other immigrant criminal groups. The West End, encompassing Soho and surrounding areas, was contested territory where various firms competed for control of illegal gambling establishments, drinking clubs, and protection rackets. South London, including Battersea, Bermondsey, and Southwark, had its own networks of criminals who operated with relative independence from the gangs north of the Thames. The economic circumstances of post-war Britain created significant opportunities for organised crime. Rationing, which continued until 1954, generated enormous demand for black market goods and criminals who could supply commodities such as meat, sugar, petrol, and clothing found ready markets and substantial profits. As rationing ended, these same networks transitioned to other forms of illegal activity, including protection rackets, targeting businesses, illegal gambling operations, and armed robbery of banks, post offices, and security vehicles carrying large sums of cash. Throughout this period, the Metropolitan Police, responsible for law enforcement across London, struggled to combat organised crime effectively. Corruption within the police force was widespread, with many officers accepting bribes from criminals in exchange for tip-offs about planned raids or for overlooking illegal activities. The relationship between police and criminals in certain areas of London was characterised by an informal understanding whereby some criminal operations were tolerated provided they remained within certain boundaries and did not attract excessive public attention. Structure of British organised crime during the 1950s and into the 1960s was based on the firm model pioneered by figures such as Billy Hill. A firm typically consisted of a core group of trusted associates who planned and executed criminal operations, supported by a wider network of individuals who provided specialised services such as safe breaking, stolen goods disposal, or the corruption of police officers and other officials. Violence was an integral tool of control, used both to discipline members who broke the firm's code of conduct and to intimidate rivals or those who refused to cooperate with protection rackets. This was the world into which Freddie Foreman was emerging in the early 1950s as he moved beyond petty crime and began establishing himself within South London's criminal networks. By the early 1950s, Freddie had moved beyond street-level crime and was establishing himself within the networks of professional criminals operating across South London. Working in association with established figures in the Battersea and Bermondsey areas, he began to participate in more sophisticated criminal operations, including armed robberies, targeting banks and post offices. The profits from these activities allowed Freddie to acquire his first legitimate business fronts, including public houses which served both as sources of legal income and as meeting places for criminal associates. It was during this period that Freddie met and began courting Maureen, a young woman from South London. They married in the early 1950s, and the couple would go on to have 3 children, Jamie, Gregory, and Danielle. Despite his increasingly criminal lifestyle, Freddie maintained the outward appearance of a legitimate publican and family man, a dual existence which would characterize much of his adult life. Shortly after his marriage, Freddie became involved with more serious criminal enterprises. His reputation as someone willing to use violence when necessary made him valuable to the established criminals who dominated South London during this period. Unlike the petty thieves and opportunistic criminals with whom he had associated in his teenage years, Freddie was now working alongside professional armed robbers and men who had established systematic operations for stealing from banks, bullion dealers, and security vehicles. One of the most audacious operations in which Freddie participated during the early phase of his criminal career took place on the 24th of May, 1963. On that day, Freddie and a group of associates wearing blue overalls walked into the offices of Sharps Pixley and Company, bullion brokers on Paul Street in the City of London, during the lunch hour when security was minimal. The group left with 40 bars of gold worth approximately £200,000, equivalent to over £4 million in modern currency when adjusted for inflation. The robbery was executed with precision, and the thieves disappeared into the crowded streets of London before the authorities could respond. The success of operations such as this established Freddie as one of South London's most capable criminals by the mid-1960s. He had developed his own firm, a core group of trusted associates who could be called upon for various criminal enterprises, and he had accumulated sufficient wealth to acquire multiple properties and business interests across South London. His primary legitimate establishment was the Prince of Wales pub on Lown Street in Southwark, which became known as one of his regular haunts and served as an informal headquarters for his operations. However, Freddie's growing success and reputation were beginning to attract attention, not only from the Metropolitan Police, but also from criminal organisations operating in other parts of London. It was in the late 1950s and early 1960s that his activities would bring him into contact with the most notorious criminal organisation in British history, an association which would define the remainder of his criminal career and ultimately lead to his downfall. The Cray twins, Ronald and Reginald, had been developing their criminal enterprise in the East End of London throughout the 1950s. Born in October 1933 in Hoxton, the identical twin brothers had emerged from the same post-war environment of poverty and social dislocation which had shaped Freddie's early life. Though their operations were centred on the opposite side of the Thames River in districts such as Bethnal Green, Whitechapel, and Mile End. By the late 1950s, the twins had established control over substantial territory in East London, running protection rackets, illegal gambling establishments, and nightclubs, while also engaging in armed robbery and other serious crimes. The Cray Twins organisation became known as the Firm, adopting the structure pioneered by earlier criminals such as Billy Hill, At its core were the twins themselves, with Ronnie, the elder, by several minutes, often taking the more aggressive and unpredictable role, while Reggie was regarded as the more calculating and business-minded of the pair. Supporting them was their older brother, Charlie Cray, who handled much of the organization's legitimate business interests and acted as a mediator when the twins' volatile personalities threatened their operations. The connection between Freddie Foreman and the Cray twins developed gradually through the early 1960s, despite the traditional territorial divisions which separated South London and East London criminal operations. Charlie Cray, concerned about his younger brother's increasingly reckless behavior and aware that their ambitions required additional support from established criminals, reached out to Freddie as someone with a reputation for professionalism and reliability. Unlike many criminals of the era who operated impulsively or allowed personal disputes to interfere with business, Freddie was known for his calculated approach to crime and his ability to maintain discipline within his own operations. It was through this introduction that Freddie began to work with the firm in the early 1960s. His role was distinct from that of the twins' East End associates, as he maintained his own independent operations in South London, while simultaneously acting as a senior advisor and enforcer when the firm required someone with his particular skills. Freddie's connections, influence, and understanding of criminal operations made him invaluable to the Crays as they sought to expand their activities beyond the East End and establish themselves as the dominant criminal organization in London. The firm's operations during the mid-1960s were extensive and varied. The twins controlled numerous nightclubs and drinking establishments across East London and increasingly in the West End, where they sought to exploit the growing nightlife scene and establish connections with celebrities and public figures. Among their most prominent establishments were Esmeralda's Barn in Knightsbridge and the Kentucky Club in Mile End, venues which attracted both criminal associates and celebrities, seeking the glamour of associating with notorious gangsters. The twins cultivated relationships with actors, musicians, and other public figures, including Barbara Windsor, who became a close friend, and they hosted various American entertainers visiting London, including the singer Judy Garland. Beyond their nightclub operations, the firm engaged in systematic protection rackets throughout the East End, demanding regular payments from businesses in exchange for protection from other criminals or from the firm itself. Those who refused to pay were subjected to violence or had their premises damaged, creating a climate of fear which ensured compliance. The organization also ran illegal gambling operations, including spielers, unlicensed gambling clubs which operated in back rooms and basements across East London. Freddie's ally involvement with the firm intensified through the mid-1960s, as the twins came to rely increasingly on his judgment and capabilities. He was present at the opening of clubs and at major events organized by the twins, and he participated in various operations which required violence or intimidation. His nickname in the Underworld, Brown Bread Fred, derived from Cockney rhyming slang for dead, reflected his particular specialty within criminal circles, as he was known for his ability to dispose of bodies and eliminate evidence when the firm's activities resulted in deaths. The firm was generating substantial income by the mid-1960s, with estimates suggesting the organization was collecting thousands of pounds weekly from protection rackets alone, while their nightclubs and illegal gambling operations produced additional revenues. However, the financial success was accompanied by increasing recklessness on the part of the Kray twins, particularly Ronnie, whose paranoid and violent temperament led to numerous incidents which attracted unwanted attention from the authorities. As the firm's operations expanded, so too did tensions with rival organizations. The Richardson Gang, led by Charlie and Eddie Richardson, controlled much of South London's criminal activity and competed with the Krays for dominance over certain rackets and territories. While Freddie maintained his own operations in South London and had connections with various criminals in the area, his association with the Krays placed him in a complicated position as tensions between the two organizations escalated through the mid-1960s. The height of the firm's power came in 1965 and 1966, when the Kray twins had established themselves as the most feared criminals in London and had successfully intimidated many potential rivals into either cooperating with them or avoiding conflict. Their celebrity connections had grown to the point where photographs of the twins with famous actors and entertainers appeared regularly in newspapers, and they cultivated an image of themselves as successful businessmen who happened to operate on the edge of legality. However, this period of success was accompanied by increasingly serious criminal acts, which would ultimately lead to the downfall of the firm. On the 9th of March 1966, Ronnie Kray walked into the Blind Beggar pub in Whitechapel and shot George Cornell, a member of the Richardson Gang, in the forehead, killing him instantly in front of numerous witnesses. Cornell had reportedly insulted Ronnie, calling him a fat poof, and the shooting was Ronnie's response to this perceived slight. The murder, carried out in a crowded public house in broad view of multiple witnesses, demonstrated the extent of Ronnie's recklessness and his belief that the firm's power made him untouchable. Following the Cornell murder, the Metropolitan Police intensified their investigations into the Kray twins and their organization. But securing witness testimony proved extremely difficult as potential witnesses feared retribution from the firm. It was in the aftermath of this killing that Freddie's role became particularly significant, as he was tasked with ensuring the witnesses remained silent and that evidence which might incriminate the twins was suppressed or destroyed. His reputation and connections allowed him to intimidate potential witnesses effectively, and his understanding of police procedures enabled him to identify weaknesses in the investigation. Despite the increased scrutiny following the Cornell murder, the Kray twins continued their operations and in fact became even more ambitious in their criminal activities. Ronnie Kray had developed an obsession with Frank Mitchell, known as the Mad Axeman, a violent criminal who was serving a sentence at Dartmoor Prison in Devon. Mitchell had befriended Ronnie during an earlier period when both were incarcerated at Wandsworth Prison, and Ronnie became convinced that breaking Mitchell out of prison would enhance the firm's reputation and demonstrate their power. In December 1966, the firm orchestrated Mitchell's escape from Dartmoor, where he had been allowed to work outside the prison as part of a rehabilitation program. The escape was successful, and Mitchell was brought to London, where he was hidden in a flat in East London. However, Mitchell quickly became a liability for the twins. He was difficult to control, had a violent temper, and demanded that the twins arrange for him to meet with representatives of the government to negotiate his surrender and a reduced sentence. His presence in London created enormous pressure on the firm as a massive manhunt was underway, and his unpredictable behavior threatened to expose the organization. After several weeks of attempting to manage the situation, the Cray twins made the decision to have Mitchell killed. On the 24th of December 1966, Mitchell was told he was being moved to a different location and was placed in a van. According to testimony which emerged years later, including Freddie's own admissions, Mitchell was shot multiple times inside the vehicle and his body was disposed of. The body was never recovered, and Mitchell's fate remained officially unknown for many years, though it was widely suspected within criminal circles that the firm had been responsible for his death. Freddie's involvement in the Mitchell killing would later become a central element in the criminal cases brought against him and the Cray twins. While maintaining his innocence during initial investigations and trials, Freddie eventually admitted in his autobiography many years later that he had been involved in the disposal of Mitchell's body, confirming the long-held suspicions of the authorities. The situation deteriorated further for the firm in October 1967 when Reggie Cray murdered Jack McVitie, known as Jack the Hat, a minor criminal who had failed to complete a contract killing which the twins had commissioned, and had subsequently made remarks which the twins regarded as disrespectful. At a party in Stoke Newington on the 28th of October, Reggie stabbed McVitie to death in front of numerous witnesses. Once again, Freddie was called upon to dispose of the body, which was driven across London to his territory in South London and disposed of in a manner which ensured it would never be recovered. By late 1967 and into 1968, the firm was under intense investigation by the Metropolitan Police, who had assembled a dedicated team to gather evidence against the Cray twins and their associates. Detective Superintendent Leonard Redd, known within the police force for his persistence and incorruptibility, led the investigation and worked systematically to identify witnesses who might be willing to testify against the twins. The investigation focused particularly on the murders of Cornell, Mitchell, and McVitie, as securing convictions for these killings would allow the authorities to imprison the twins for lengthy sentences and effectively dismantle their organization. While Freddie maintained his own operations separate from many of the firm's activities during this period, his close association with the Cray twins and his involvement in covering up their most serious crimes had placed him in an extremely vulnerable position as the investigation progressed. With some of the proceeds from his criminal operations, Freddie had established himself as one of South London's most successful independent operators by the mid-1960s. While his association with the Cray twins brought him into contact with high-profile criminal activities in East London, Freddie maintained his own separate firm and conducted numerous operations which had no connection to the firm. His primary base remained the Prince of Wales pub on Lance Street in Southwark, though he acquired additional properties across South London, which served both as legitimate business investments and as locations for meetings with criminal associates. Freddie's independent operations focused primarily on armed robbery, an activity which offered substantial financial rewards for those willing to accept the considerable risks involved. Unlike the protection rackets and nightclub operations which formed the core of the Kray twins' business. Armed robbery required careful planning, reliable associates who could be trusted under pressure, and the ability to dispose of stolen goods or launder large sums of cash without attracting attention from the authorities. Freddie had developed expertise in all of these areas through years of experience, and by the 1960s, he was regarded as one of the most capable organizers of robberies in London. The methods employed in these operations followed established patterns developed by earlier generations of criminals. A typical robbery would involve extensive surveillance of the target location to identify security weaknesses, establish the movements of security guards or bank staff, and determine the optimal timing for the operation. Once planning was complete, a team of between 3 and 6 men would execute the robbery, often wearing disguises or workmen's overalls to avoid being identified. The stolen cash or goods would then be transported to a safe location where it could be counted and divided among the participants, with Freddie typically taking the largest share as the organizer of the operation. One particularly significant robbery, which has been attributed to Freddie and his associates, involved a raid on a bank in South London during the early 1960s, though the specific details remain unclear owing to the passage of time and the reluctance of participants to provide detailed accounts. What is known is that the operation netted a substantial sum, estimated at tens of thousands of pounds, and was executed with sufficient professionalism that the perpetrators were never identified or apprehended by the police. The wealth accumulated through these operations allowed Freddie to acquire multiple properties and business interests. In addition to the Prince of Wales pub, he owned residential properties in various parts of South London, which provided rental income and could be used to house associates or to store stolen goods. These properties were typically purchased through intermediaries or registered in the names of family members to avoid drawing attention from the authorities who might question how a publican could afford such extensive holdings. Laundering the proceeds from armed robberies presented significant challenges. Large sums of cash could not simply be deposited in banks without raising suspicions, particularly during a period when the authorities were actively investigating organized crime. Freddie's employed various methods to convert his illegal earnings into apparently legitimate wealth. Some money was invested in his licensed premises, where it could be mixed with legitimate takings from the pub. Other sums were used to purchase property or luxury items which could later be sold, creating the appearance that the money derived from these sales rather than from criminal activity. Additionally, Freddie maintained connections with individuals who specialized in moving money abroad or converting it into forms which were more difficult for authorities to trace. Despite his substantial wealth, Freddie maintained a considerably lower public profile than the Kray twins, whose photographs regularly appeared in newspapers and who actively cultivated celebrity associations. Freddie's approach to his criminal career was more discreet, avoiding unnecessary attention and focusing on profitable operations rather than on reputation or notoriety. This more cautious approach reflected his professional understanding that excessive publicity increased the likelihood of police scrutiny and made it more difficult to operate effectively. By the late 1960s, Freddie had accumulated wealth estimated at hundreds of thousands of pounds, making him one of the most financially successful criminals of his generation. His properties across South London, his licensed premises, and his various investments provided both substantial, legitimate income and effective cover for his continued criminal activities. The lifestyle afforded by this wealth included expensive cars, tailored clothing, and the ability to support his family comfortably, though Freddie avoided the ostentatious displays of wealth which characterized some of his criminal contemporaries. However, by the late 1960s, the criminal landscape, which had allowed figures like Freddie and the Krays to flourish, was beginning to shift dramatically. The Metropolitan Police had intensified their investigations into organized crime, driven in part by public concern about the growing power of criminal gangs and in part by embarrassment at their failure to secure convictions against prominent criminals despite widespread knowledge of their activities. Detective Superintendent Leonard Reed's investigation into the Kray twins was progressing systematically, and the net which was closing around the firm threatened to ensnare Freddie as well, owing to his close association with the twins and his involvement in several of their most serious crimes. By the late 1960s, the Metropolitan Police had intensified their investigations into London's organised crime networks, with particular focus on the Kray twins and their associates. Detective Superintendent Leonard Reed had been appointed to lead a specialised unit tasked with gathering sufficient evidence to secure convictions against the twins for serious crimes including murder. The investigation proceeded methodically through 1967 and into 1968, with officers working to identify witnesses who might be willing to testify and to build cases around the murders of George Cornell, Frank Mitchell, and Jack McVitie. The Frank Mitchell case presented significant challenges for investigators. Mitchell had escaped from Dartmoor Prison on the 12th of December 1966, and his subsequent disappearance had generated substantial media attention and political controversy regarding prison security. The authorities suspected that the Kray twins had orchestrated the escape and were responsible for Mitchell's presumed death, but without a body and with witnesses too frightened to provide testimony, building a prosecutable case proved extremely difficult. It was widely known within criminal circles that Mitchell had become a liability for the firm, and that he had been killed shortly before Christmas 1966. But securing evidence which could be presented in court was another matter entirely. The murder of Jack McVitie on the 28th of October 1967 provided investigators with a more promising avenue for prosecution. Unlike the Mitchell case, there had been numerous witnesses to the killing at the party in Stoke Newington, where Reggie Kray had stabbed McVitie to death. Additionally, the body had been transported across London for disposal, involving multiple individuals and creating opportunities for the investigation to identify participants and pressure them to cooperate. The investigation established that the body had been taken to Freddie's territory in South London, though, like Mitchell's remains, it was never recovered. Throughout the investigation, Freddie was aware of the mounting danger. His involvement in disposing of McVitie's body and his admitted role in the Mitchell killing placed him at serious risk of arrest and prosecution. Additionally, his long association with the Kray twins and his participation in various aspects of the firm's operations meant that he could potentially face charges relating to numerous other crimes. The traditional code of silence, which had protected criminals from prosecution, was beginning to erode as the police applied pressure to lower-level associates and offered reduced sentences in exchange for testimony. On the 8th of May 1968, police units moved simultaneously against the Cray twins and numerous members of their organization in a coordinated series of raids across London. Ronnie and Reggie Cray were arrested at separate locations and taken into custody, along with dozens of their associates. The arrests represented the culmination of months of intensive investigation and marked the beginning of the end for the firm as an organized criminal enterprise. Freddie was not arrested during the initial raids, but he was acutely aware that his connection to the Cray twins placed him in an extremely precarious position. As the investigation continued through the remainder of 1968, and associates began to provide testimony to the police, the likelihood of charges being brought against him increased substantially. The evidence which was being assembled related particularly to the disposal of Jack McVitie's body, a crime for which multiple witnesses could potentially testify regarding Freddie's involvement. The trial of the Cray twins commenced in January 1969 at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court, in proceedings which attracted enormous media attention and public interest. Ronald and Reggie Cray faced charges including the murders of George Cornell and Jack McVitie, while numerous associates were charged with various offences relating to their involvement with the firm. The prosecution case was built on testimony from witnesses who had been persuaded to cooperate with the police, many of whom had been offered reduced sentences or other inducements in exchange for their testimony. The trial proceedings continued for several weeks as the prosecution presented evidence relating to the murders and to the wider operations of the firm. Witnesses described the shooting of George Cornell in the Blind Beggar pub and the stabbing of Jack McVitie at the party in Stoke Newington. The defense attempted to discredit witnesses by highlighting their own criminal backgrounds and suggesting that their testimony had been coerced or fabricated in exchange for favorable treatment from the authorities. However, the weight of evidence against the twins proved overwhelming. On the 8th of March 1969, after deliberating for 6 hours and 55 minutes, the jury returned guilty verdicts against both Ronnie and Reggie Cray for the murders of Cornell and McVitie. Mr. Justice Melford Stevenson sentenced each twin to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that they serve at least 30 years before being considered for parole, an exceptionally lengthy minimum term which reflected the severity of their crimes and the extent of their criminal enterprises. The sentences effectively ended the Cray twins' control over London's Underworld and dismantled the firm as an operational criminal organization. Freddie's own legal troubles intensified in the aftermath of the Cray convictions. In June 1969, he was arrested and charged with being an accessory to the murder of Jack McVitie, specifically relating to his role in disposing of the body. The charge reflected the prosecution's assessment that while they had sufficient evidence to prove Freddie's involvement in the disposal of McVitie's remains, they lacked the evidence necessary to prove that he had participated directly in the killing itself or had prior knowledge of the plan to murder McVitie. The trial took place later in 1969 at the Old Bailey. The prosecution presented testimony from witnesses who had been at the party where McVitie was killed and who described how the body had been wrapped and placed in a vehicle for transportation to South London. Additional witnesses testified regarding Freddie's reputation and his known association with the Cray twins. The defense argued that the prosecution's case relied entirely on the testimony of witnesses who were themselves criminals and who had been offered inducements to cooperate, and that there was no physical evidence linking Freddie to the disposal of McVitie's body. The jury deliberated for a considerable period before returning a guilty verdict. Freddie was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment for his role in disposing of McVitie's body, a substantial sentence which reflected both the seriousness of the offense and the court's determination to send a clear message regarding those who assisted major criminals in evading justice. He was initially sent to serve his sentence at a maximum security prison, where he was classified as a Category A prisoner, owing to concerns that his connections in the criminal underworld might facilitate an escape attempt or allow him to continue directing criminal operations from within the prison system. At the time of his conviction, Freddie was 37 years old, and the prospect of spending a decade in prison represented a significant interruption to both his criminal career and his family life. His wife, Maureen, and their 3 children would have to manage without him during the years of his incarceration, though the wealth he had accumulated during his criminal career provided some financial security for the family. During his imprisonment, Freddie maintained contact with the various associates from the criminal underworld and developed relationships with other high-profile prisoners. The British prison system during the 1970s housed numerous individuals who had been convicted of serious organized crime offenses, and the interaction between these prisoners allowed for the continuation of criminal networks and the planning of future operations. However, Freddie served his sentence without major disciplinary incidents, a pattern of behavior which would eventually assist him in securing parole. He was released from prison in the late 1970s after serving the majority of his 10-year sentence, with time reduced for good behavior. Upon his release, Freddie returned to South London and to his family, but he found a criminal landscape which had changed considerably during his years of incarceration. The Cray twins remained in prison and would never be released, their empire having been dismantled and their former territory divided among other criminal organizations. Many of Freddie's former associates had either retired from criminal activity, been imprisoned themselves, or been killed in the conflicts which had erupted following the fall of the firm. Despite these changes, and despite the substantial price he had paid for his criminal activities, Freddie did not retire from crime. Instead, he began to rebuild his operations, focusing once again on armed robbery as his primary source of illegal income. The methods and targets had evolved during the 1970s, with security companies and cash-in-transit vehicles replacing banks and post offices as the preferred targets for sophisticated criminal organizations. These operations required careful planning and execution, but offered substantial rewards for those willing to accept the risks. It was during this period that Freddie became involved in planning what would become one of the most notorious robberies in British criminal history. The Security Express Depot in Shoreditch in East London was a facility where cash from various businesses was collected and stored before being distributed to banks. On the night of the 2nd of April 1983, a gang of armed men broke into the depot, overpowered the security guards, and stole approximately £6 million in cash, banknotes, and travelers' checks. The robbery was executed with professional precision, with the perpetrators using inside knowledge of the facility's security procedures and the movements of staff. The Security Express robbery represented at the time the largest cash robbery in British history, and the scale of the theft generated enormous media attention and political pressure on the Metropolitan Police to identify and apprehend those responsible. The investigation was extensive and involved hundreds of officers working to trace the stolen money and to identify the individuals who had planned and executed the robbery. Freddie's involvement in the Security Express robbery would later be established through various forms of evidence, including surveillance, witness testimony, and the tracing of stolen banknotes, which had entered circulation through his associates. However, identifying the perpetrators and gathering sufficient evidence to secure convictions took considerable time, during which Freddie and other participants in the robbery were able to spend or launder substantial portions of the stolen money. In 1989, more than 6 years after the robbery, Freddie was arrested and charged with handling the proceeds from the Security Express theft. The charge reflected the difficulty the prosecution faced in proving direct involvement in the robbery itself, but handling stolen goods represented a serious offense which carried substantial prison sentences. The trial took place at the Old Bailey in 1990, with the prosecution presenting evidence regarding large sums of money which had passed through Freddie's hands in the years following the robbery, and of which could be traced to the stolen banknotes. The jury convicted Freddie of handling the proceeds from the robbery, and he was sentenced to 9 years imprisonment. This second lengthy prison sentence came when Freddie was already 58 years old, and it meant that he would spend the majority of his 60s incarcerated. He was once again classified as a high-security prisoner and was sent to serve his sentence in prisons, including HMP Full Sutton in Yorkshire and later HMP Bullingdon in Oxfordshire. In addition to these convictions, Freddie had been tried on 2 separate occasions during the 1960s for murder charges and had been acquitted both times. The first trial related to the murder of Frank Mitchell, where the prosecution had been unable to present sufficient evidence to prove Freddie's involvement, despite widespread suspicion within the police and criminal underworld that he had participated in Mitchell's killing. The second trial related to the murder of Tommy Ginger Marks, a criminal who had been killed in the 1960s in what was believed to be retaliation for the shooting of Freddie's brother, who had been shot in the legs during a dispute. In both cases, the prosecution had been hampered by the absence of bodies, the refusal of witnesses to testify, and the destruction or absence of physical evidence. However, many years later, in his autobiography, published in 2007, Freddie admitted to both murders. In the case of Frank Mitchell, he confirmed that he had participated in the killing on the orders of the Cray twins, who had become convinced that Mitchell's presence in London and his increasingly erratic behavior posed an unacceptable risk to the firm. Mitchell had been shot inside a van on Christmas Eve 1966, and his body had been disposed of in a manner which ensured it would never be recovered. In the case of Tommy Marks, Freddie confirmed that he had killed Marks in revenge for the shooting of his brother, a killing which adhered to the Underworld code, whereby violence against family members demanded retaliation. These admissions, made decades after the events and long after the statute of limitations and double jeopardy protections made further prosecution impossible, confirmed what the authorities had long suspected but had been unable to prove. They also provided insight into the extent of violence which had characterized organized crime in London during the 1960s, and into Freddie's role as one of the most dangerous and capable enforcers of his generation. By the time of his release from prison in the late 1990s, having served his 9-year sentence for the Security Express robbery, Freddie had spent a total of 16 years of his life incarcerated. He was now in his late 60s, and the criminal landscape of London had changed beyond recognition from the world he had known during his prime. The old territorial divisions between East End, West End and South London gangs had been replaced by new criminal organizations often organized along ethnic lines and focused primarily on drug trafficking, rather than the armed robberies and protection rackets which had defined organized crime in earlier decades. Following the Security Express robbery in April 1983, Freddie made the decision to leave Britain as the Metropolitan Police launched an extensive investigation into the theft. Spain had long been a destination for British criminals seeking to avoid prosecution, as the country's extradition treaty with the United Kingdom contained provisions which made it difficult for British authorities to secure the return of suspects for certain categories of offences. The Costa del Sol, in particular, had developed a substantial expatriate community of British criminals who had fled the country to escape investigation or imprisonment. Freddie settled in Spain in the mid-1980s, establishing himself in one of the coastal towns which had become popular with British expatriates. The lifestyle offered by the Costa del Sol was comfortable for those with access to substantial funds, and Freddie had considerable resources available from his share of the Security Express proceeds and from other criminal activities over the years. He acquired property in Spain and established a routine which allowed him to live openly despite being wanted by British authorities. The British criminal community in Spain during this period included numerous individuals who had fled to avoid prosecution for serious offences. These expatriates maintained connections with criminal associates in Britain and, in some cases, continued to participate in criminal operations, using Spain as a safe base from which to plan activities or to which stolen proceeds could be transferred. Freddie maintained contact with various associates and remained connected to criminal networks despite his physical absence from Britain. Spanish law during this period made it extremely difficult for British authorities to extradite suspects for certain offences, particularly those involving armed robbery or handling stolen goods, as Spanish courts often required a higher burden of proof than British courts and were reluctant to extradite individuals who might face lengthy prison sentences. This legal protection, combined with the practical difficulties of conducting investigations across international borders, meant that many British criminals were able to live in Spain for years or even decades without facing prosecution. However, circumstances, both personal and legal, eventually forced Freddie to reconsider his position as a fugitive. The extended separation from family members in Britain created significant personal pressures, while the ongoing investigation into the Security Express robbery meant that associates in Britain were increasingly at risk of arrest and might provide testimony which would implicate Freddie. Additionally, changes to extradition law and increased cooperation between British and Spanish authorities were making Spain a less secure refuge for wanted criminals. The precise circumstances of Freddie's decision to return to Britain remain unclear, but by the late 1980s, he had made the calculation that returning to face charges offered better prospects than remaining indefinitely as a fugitive. In 1989, he returned to British soil, where he was arrested shortly thereafter and charged with handling the proceeds from the Security Express robbery. The years spent in Spain had provided Freddie with a comfortable lifestyle and had delayed his prosecution, but they had not resolved his legal difficulties or eliminated the evidence which the Metropolitan Police had been systematically gathering throughout his absence. His return marked the beginning of the final major criminal case of his career and would result in his second lengthy prison sentence. In 1989, after nearly 2 decades as a fugitive in Spain and following several years of comfortable exile on the Costa del Sol, circumstances force Freddie's return to British soil. The precise motivations for his decision to return remain somewhat unclear, though various factors appear to have contributed to his calculation that facing prosecution in Britain offered better prospects than remaining indefinitely abroad. Among these were concerns regarding his health, the extended separation from family members, including his children who remained in Britain, and advice from legal representatives regarding potential outcomes if he were to surrender voluntarily. Upon his return to Britain, Freddie was arrested by officers from the Metropolitan Police who had maintained surveillance on his anticipated arrival. The arrest had been anticipated by both Freddie and the authorities, and he was taken into custody without incident. He was formally charged with handling the proceeds from the Security Express robbery, a serious offence which carried substantial prison sentences, but which was considered easier to prove than direct participation in the robbery itself. The investigation into the Security Express robbery had continued throughout the years of Freddie's absence from Britain. Officers had traced substantial quantities of stolen banknotes which had entered circulation through various channels, and they had identified connections between these notes and individuals known to associate with Freddie. Additionally, surveillance had documented meetings and financial transactions in the years following the robbery, which suggested involvement in laundering the proceeds. Several of Freddie's associates had been arrested and charged in connection with the robbery, and some had provided testimony which implicated him in the handling of stolen money. The trial took place at the Old Bailey in 1990. The prosecution case focused on demonstrating that Freddie had received, stored, and helped to launder substantial sums of money, which could be traced to the Security Express theft. Evidence presented included financial records, witness testimony from associates who had cooperated with the investigation, and forensic analysis of banknotes which had been recovered during searches of properties connected to Freddie. The prosecution argued that the scale of the sums involved and the sophisticated methods used to launder the money demonstrated that Freddie had been a central figure in the conspiracy to profit from the robbery. The defense strategy centered on challenging the reliability of witnesses who had agreed to cooperate with the police, arguing that their testimony had been secured through promises of reduced sentences or other inducements, and that they had strong motivations to implicate Freddie falsely. Additionally, the defense contested the forensic evidence regarding the banknotes, arguing that the mere presence of stolen notes in circulation did not conclusively prove that Freddie had handled them directly or had knowledge of their origins. The trial proceedings continued for several weeks as witnesses were examined and cross-examined, and as expert testimony regarding financial transactions and forensic evidence was presented to the jury. The media coverage of the trial was extensive, as the Security Express robbery remained one of the most notorious crimes in British history, and Freddie's reputation as a former associate of the Kray twins generated significant public interest. The jury deliberated for several days before returning a guilty verdict on the charge of handling the proceeds from the Security Express robbery. The judge, in sentencing Freddie, emphasized the seriousness of the offense and the sophisticated nature of the money laundering operation which had been conducted. Freddie was sentenced to 9 years imprisonment, a substantial sentence which reflected both the scale of the sums involved and the court's determination to impose penalties which would deter others from participating in similar offences. At the time of his conviction in 1990, Freddie was 58 years old, and the 9-year sentence meant that he would spend much of his 60s incarcerated. He was classified as a Category A prisoner, owing to his history of serious offences and his connections within the criminal underworld, and he was initially sent to serve his sentence at HMP Full Sutton, a maximum security prison in Yorkshire, which housed some of Britain's most dangerous criminals. He would later be transferred to HMP Bullingdon in Oxfordshire, where he served the remainder of his sentence. During the trial and in subsequent years, questions remained regarding Freddie's involvement in murders which had occurred during the 1960s. He had been tried on 2 separate occasions during that decade for murder charges and had been acquitted both times owing to insufficient evidence. The first trial had related to the murder of Frank Mitchell, the Mad Axeman, who had disappeared in December 1966 after being broken out of Dartmoor prison by the Kray twins. The prosecution had been unable to prove Freddie's involvement, despite strong suspicions within the police that he had participated in Mitchell's killing and the disposal of his body. The second murder trial had related to Tommy Ginger Marks, a criminal who had been killed in the 1960s in what was believed to be retaliation for an attack on Freddie's brother. Marks had disappeared and his body was never recovered, and the prosecution's case had been hampered by the absence of physical evidence and the refusal of witnesses to provide testimony. The acquittals in both cases had been attributed to the difficulty of securing convictions for murder without bodies and without cooperative witnesses, and to the effectiveness of intimidation which had prevented potential witnesses from coming forward. However, many years later in his autobiography, Brown Bread Fred, published in 2007, Freddie admitted to both murders. He confirmed that he had participated in the killing of Frank Mitchell on the orders of the Kray twins, who had concluded that Mitchell's presence in London posed too great a risk to their organisation. Mitchell had been shot on the 24th of December 1966, and his body had been disposed of in a manner which ensured it would never be found. In the case of Tommy Marks, Freddie admitted that he had killed Marks in revenge for the shooting of his brother, who had been shot in the legs during a criminal dispute. These admissions, made decades after the events when further prosecution was no longer possible owing to double jeopardy protections confirmed what law enforcement had long suspected but had been unable to prove in court. The convictions for disposing of Jack McVitie's body and for handling the proceeds from the Security Express robbery, combined with the later admissions regarding the Mitchell and Marks murders, established Freddie as one of the most dangerous and prolific criminals of his generation. The total of 16 years, which he served in prison, represented only a portion of his criminal career, and many observers noted that had the full extent of his activities been successfully prosecuted, he would likely have faced life imprisonment similar to that imposed on the Kray twins. By the 1990s, a new generation of criminals had emerged in London's underworld, operating with methods and priorities which differed substantially from those of Freddie's era. The traditional structure of territorial gangs controlling specific areas of London and engaging primarily in protection rackets, illegal gambling, and armed robbery had been superseded by organizations focused predominantly on drug trafficking. The enormous profits available from the cocaine and heroin trades dwarfed the returns from the robberies and rackets, which had characterized organized crime in the 1960s and 1970s, and younger criminals increasingly viewed the old-school gangsters as relics of a bygone era. The territorial divisions which had defined London crime for decades had largely broken down by the 1990s. Rather than firms controlling East End or South London territories, new organizations formed along ethnic lines or around specific drug distribution networks which operated across the entire city and beyond. Turkish and Kurdish criminal groups controlled significant portions of the heroin trade, while Jamaican organizations dominated certain aspects of the cocaine and crack cocaine markets. These groups operated with different codes and structures than the traditional British criminal firms, and violence was often deployed more readily and with less regard for the unwritten rules which had governed conflicts during Freddie's active years. The methods of the new generation also differed substantially. Where Freddie and his contemporaries had relied on personal relationships, loyalty within firms, and the maintenance of reputations which discouraged challenges, the drug-focused organizations of the 1990s operated more as businesses, with suppliers, distributors, and street-level dealers forming networks which could be reorganized or replaced as circumstances required. The personal element which had characterized organized crime in earlier decades, where disputes were often resolved through negotiation or limited violence between known parties, had been replaced by a more impersonal and often more brutal approach. Armed robbery, which had been Freddie's primary criminal activity throughout his career, had become increasingly difficult and less profitable by the 1990s. Security measures at banks and cash transport operations had improved substantially, with sophisticated alarm systems, armed guards, and tracking devices, making robberies significantly more dangerous and less likely to succeed. Additionally, the widespread adoption of electronic banking meant that less cash was physically transported or stored in locations vulnerable to robbery. The Security Express theft of £6 million in 1983 represented a type of operation which had become far more difficult to execute successfully a decade later. Despite these fundamental changes in the criminal landscape, or perhaps because of them, the era of Freddie and the Kray twins began to acquire a certain romantic gloss in British popular culture. The old-school gangsters were increasingly portrayed in films books and documentaries as following codes of honor, maintaining loyalty to associates, and operating with a professionalism which contrasted favorably with the perceived chaos and brutality of contemporary drug-related crime. This romanticization ignored or minimized the reality of the violence which these criminals had inflicted, but it reflected a broader cultural nostalgia for an imagined past when even criminals supposedly adhered to recognizable rules. Freddie's status as one of the last surviving major figures from the Cray era contributed to growing public interest in his life and career. By the time he was serving his sentence for the Security Express robbery in the 1990s, he had become something of a celebrity within British popular culture, representing a connection to a period of London history which was rapidly receding into memory. The combination of his genuine involvement in serious crimes, his association with the Cray twins, and his survival through decades of criminal activity created a public persona which attracted significant media attention. While serving his 9-year sentence for handling the proceeds from the Security Express robbery, Freddie was housed in several prisons, including HMP Full Sutton and HMP Bullingdon. His behavior during this incarceration was generally cooperative, and he avoided the disciplinary problems which might have extended his sentence or resulted in his being held in maximum security conditions throughout the entire period. This approach to imprisonment reflected a pragmatic understanding that good behavior would facilitate earlier release on parole and would allow him to serve his time under less restrictive conditions. During his imprisonment, Freddie began to consider how he might capitalize on public interest in his criminal career. The market for books and documentaries about British gangsters had grown substantially during the 1980s and 1990s, with numerous accounts of the Cray twins and other criminals proving commercially successful. Freddie recognized that his unique perspective as a close associate of the twins and as a successful criminal in his own right offered material which would attract publishers and documentary makers. He was released from prison in the late 1990s, having served the majority of his 9-year sentence, with time reduced for good behavior. At the time of his release, Freddie was approaching 70 years of age, and the prospect of returning to active criminal operations was no longer realistic. Instead, he focused on establishing a new phase of his life, one in which his criminal past would become a source of income through legitimate means rather than through continued illegal activity. By the time Freddie was in his 60s and serving his sentence for the Security Express robbery, he had become something of a celebrity within British popular culture. The combination of his association with the Cray twins, his admitted involvement in multiple murders, and his participation in one of Britain's largest cash robberies had established him as one of the most notorious criminals of his generation. Media interest in the Cray era remains substantial, driven in part by nostalgia for a period when organized crime in London operated according to recognizable structures and apparent codes of conduct, in contrast to the drug-related violence which characterized contemporary criminal activity. This public fascination created opportunities for Freddie to transform his criminal past into a source of legitimate income. Publishers recognized that first-hand accounts from participants in major crimes attracted substantial readerships, particularly when those accounts offered insights into notorious figures such as the Cray twins. Documentary makers similarly sought interviews with surviving members of the firm and other criminal organizations from the 1960s, as these individuals could provide perspectives which were not available from police files or newspaper reports. Freddie began work on his autobiography while serving his sentence, collaborating with writers who could help structure his recollections into publishable form. The resulting book, Brown Bread Fred, was published in 2007 and provided detailed accounts of his criminal career, his relationship with the Cray twins, and his involvement in various crimes including the murders of Frank Mitchell and Tommy Ginger Marks. The book was commercially successful and established Freddie as a sought-after subject for interviews and documentary appearances. The admissions contained in the autobiography regarding murders for which he had previously been acquitted generated significant media attention and some controversy. By the time of publication, double jeopardy protections meant that Freddie could not be prosecuted again for crimes for which he had been acquitted, allowing him to confirm details of killings which the authorities had long suspected but had been unable to prove in court. These revelations provided confirmation of the extent of violence which had characterized London's organized crime during the 1960s and offered insights into the methods used by criminals to evade prosecution. Following the publication of his autobiography, Freddie participated in numerous television documentaries about British organized crime, the Cray twins, and specific crimes such as the Security Express robbery. His willingness to discuss his criminal past in detail and his survival as one of the last major figures from the Cray era made him a valuable contributor to these productions. He also gave interviews to newspapers and magazines in which he discussed his life, his criminal career, and his perspectives on contemporary crime. The financial returns from these media activities provided Freddie with income during his later years and allowed him to maintain a comfortable lifestyle despite having spent 16 years in prison and having much of his criminally acquired wealth confiscated by authorities. The transformation from active criminal to professional reminiscer represented a final phase of his career, one in which his past became a commodity, which could be marketed to a public fascinated by the history of British organized crime. On his release from prison in the late 1990s, Freddie returned to a London which had changed dramatically during his years of incarceration. He was now approaching 70 years of age, and the prospect of returning to active criminal operations was no longer realistic, given both his age and the transformation of the criminal landscape. The armed robberies which had characterized his career were increasingly difficult to execute successfully owing to improved security measures, while the drug-focused crime which dominated contemporary organized activity held little appeal for someone of his generation and experience. Instead, Freddie focused on establishing himself in what became a new phase of his career, transforming his criminal past into a source of legitimate income through media appearances and publishing. He settled in North London with his partner, Janice, maintaining contact with his children, Jamie, Gregory, and Danielle, though his relationship with his family had been strained by his lengthy periods of imprisonment and by the violent nature of his criminal activities. His son Jamie had pursued a career as an actor, appearing in British films and television programs, including the soap opera EastEnders and films such as Layer Cake and Nil by Mouth. achieving success in the entertainment industry independent of his father's notoriety. The first major product of Freddie's new career was his autobiography, Brown Bread Fred, published in 2007 when he was 75 years old. The book was written in collaboration with professional writers and provided detailed accounts of his criminal activities, his relationship with the Kray twins, and his involvement in murders for which he had been tried and acquitted decades earlier. The decision to admit to the murders of Frank Mitchell and Tommy Marks generated significant controversy, as these confessions confirmed what law enforcement had long suspected but had been unable to prove in court. In the book, Freddie portrayed himself as a professional criminal who had operated according to a code of conduct, maintaining loyalty to associates and using violence only when necessary to protect himself or to enforce the Underworld's rules. He described his involvement in disposing of Jack McVitie's body as a service performed for the Kray twins, and he framed the killing of Tommy Marks as justified retaliation for an attack on his brother. This self-betrayal emphasized his professionalism and adherence to criminal codes, while minimizing the impact of his violence on victims and their families. The commercial success of the autobiography led to numerous opportunities for documentary appearances and interviews. Freddie participated in several television documentaries about British organized crime, including programs specifically focused on the Kray twins, the Security Express robbery, and the broader history of London's criminal underworld during the 1960s and 1970s. These appearances typically involved Freddie recounting stories from his criminal career, discussing his relationship with the Kray twins, and offering his perspectives on how organized crime had evolved since his active years. In 2018, when Freddie was 86 years old, a biographical documentary titled Fred was released. Directed by Paul Van Carter, the film was produced with Freddie's cooperation and featured extensive interviews with him discussing his life and reflecting on his criminal career. Unlike many documentaries which glamorized the lives of gangsters, Fred was marketed as a more somber and intimate examination of an elderly criminal confronting the consequences of his choices. The film included footage of Freddie visiting locations associated with his past, including sites where murders had occurred and properties he had owned during his active criminal years. The documentary also examined Freddie's circumstances in old age, revealing that despite his media work and book sales, he was living in reduced financial circumstances and facing health problems associated with his advanced age. By this time, Freddie's relationship with his family had become strained, and reports suggested he had become somewhat isolated despite his public profile. The contrast between his notorious past and his diminished present circumstances formed a central theme of the documentary. Throughout his later years, Freddie maintained the position that his criminal activities had been justified by the circumstances of his upbringing and by the codes which governed the criminal underworld of his era. He expressed limited remorse for his actions, arguing that he had operated according to rules which were understood by all participants in organized crime, and that violence had been a necessary tool in that environment. This attitude reflected a broader pattern among criminals of his generation, who portrayed themselves as products of their time and environment, rather than as perpetrators of serious harm against victims. Freddie's health declined through his 80s, and by 2018, he was reported to be living in a nursing home with limited financial resources and estranged from much of his family. The man who had accumulated substantial wealth through decades of crime and who had been one of London's most feared criminals now faced old age in circumstances which stood in stark contrast to the power and influence he had once wielded. His transformation from active criminal to media personality had provided him with a final career, but it had not resolved the fundamental consequences of a life built on violence and criminality. Retry, W.L. Despite the violence he had overseen and the admitted murders in his autobiography, the romantic image of the old-school British gangster, which Freddie represented, remained strong in British popular culture. Public fascination with the Kray era and with criminals of Freddie's generation persisted through the decades following their imprisonment, driven in part by nostalgia for a period when organized crime operated according to recognizable structures and when criminals were perceived to follow codes of honor and loyalty. This romanticization of British gangster history manifested in numerous films, books, and documentaries, which portrayed the Kray twins and their associates as complex figures operating within a specific cultural and historical context. Films such as The Krays, released in 1990, and Legend, released in 2015, depicted the twins as charismatic and dangerous criminals whose violence was contextualized by their working-class East End origins and their loyalty to family and associates. These portrayals often minimized or aestheticized the reality of their violence, while emphasizing the glamour of their celebrity associations and their challenge to established authority. The broader cultural phenomenon of gangster tourism developed in London, with walking tours of East End locations associated with the Kray twins, and visits to pubs and clubs which had been controlled by the firm or by other criminal organizations. These tours presented the criminal history of London as a form of heritage, with guides recounting stories of robberies, murders, and territorial conflicts as though they were colorful episodes in the city's past rather than serious crimes which had caused substantial harm to victims and communities. Freddie benefited from this cultural interest through his book sales, documentary appearances, and interview fees. His willingness to discuss his criminal activities in detail and his survival as one of the last major figures from the Kray era made him a sought-after subject for media productions about British organized crime. The combination of his genuine involvement in serious crimes and his ability to articulate his experiences in ways which audiences found compelling created a marketable public persona. However, this romanticization existed in tension with the reality of the harm which Freddie and his criminal associates had inflicted. The families of murder victims, including those of George Cornell, Frank Mitchell, Jack McVitie, and Tommy Marks, received little attention in the media narratives, which focused on the criminals themselves rather than on those they had harmed. The transformation of serious violence into entertainment and the portrayal of murderers as folk heroes represented a troubling aspect of British popular culture's relationship with its criminal history. The neighbourhoods of South London, which had produced Freddie, had changed substantially by the early 21st century. Areas such as Battersea, once characterised by working-class poverty and limited opportunities, had undergone gentrification as property values increased and wealthier residents moved into renovated housing. The Prince of Wales pub on Lant Street, which had served as Freddie's base during his active criminal years, had closed, and the building had been converted to other uses. The physical landscape which had shaped his early life and criminal career had been transformed by economic and social changes which had made London a very different city from the one he had known during the 1950s and 1960s. Today, British organised crime operates in ways which would be largely unrecognisable to Freddie and his generation. The focus on drug trafficking, the international nature of criminal networks, and the use of technology for both criminal operations and law enforcement have created an environment which bears little resemblance to the world of territorial firms, armed robberies, and personal loyalties which characterized organized crime during Freddie's active years. The old codes and structures have been replaced by more fluid and often more violent organizations, motivated primarily by profit rather than by reputation or territorial control. The cultural artifacts associated with Freddie's era extended beyond films and documentaries to include museum exhibitions and academic studies of British organised crime. Museum of London and other institutions developed exhibits examining the social history of crime in the capital, including displays relating to the Kray twins and other notorious criminals. These exhibits attempted to contextualize criminal activity within broader social and economic conditions while acknowledging the harm inflicted on victims and communities. Academic researchers in criminology and social history produced studies examining the structures and operations of organized crime in mid-20th century Britain. These scholarly works analyzed the economic conditions which fostered criminal activity, the relationship between police and criminals, the role of corruption in allowing criminal enterprises to flourish, and the social codes which governed behavior within criminal organizations. Freddie's autobiography and his interviews with researchers provided primary source material for these studies, though academics generally approached his accounts with appropriate skepticism regarding self-serving narratives and selective memory. The legal and law enforcement response to organized crime evolved substantially in the decades following Freddie's conviction. The creation of specialized units within police forces to investigate complex criminal conspiracies, the development of witness protection programs to encourage testimony from those inside criminal organizations, and the implementation of proceeds of crime legislation allowing authorities to seize assets obtained through illegal activity represented attempts to address the limitations which had previously hampered prosecutions. These developments made it significantly more difficult for criminals to operate with the relative impunity which Freddie and his generation had sometimes enjoyed. The Kray twins themselves remained in prison until their deaths, with Ronnie Kray dying on the 17th of March 1995 at the age of 61 from a heart attack while serving his sentence at Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility to which he had been transferred, owing to his diagnosed paranoid schizophrenia. Reggie Kray was released on compassionate grounds in August 2000 when he was suffering from terminal bladder cancer, and he died on the 1st of October 2000 at the age of 66. The funerals of both twins attracted substantial media attention and large crowds of mourners, demonstrating the continued public fascination with their lives despite their lengthy imprisonments. Other associates of the firm either served prison sentences, retired from criminal activity, or were killed in disputes with rivals. The dismantling of the Kray organization created opportunities for other criminals to establish themselves in territories previously controlled by the firm, leading to a period of conflict and reorganization within London's underworld during the 1970s. However, none of the successor organizations achieved the level of notoriety or cultural impact of the Kray twins, in part because media and public attention has shifted to other concerns, and in part because the structures of organized crime were evolving in ways which made individual criminal leaders less prominent. The Security Express robbery remained one of the most notorious crimes in British history, and the case continued to generate interest decades after the theft. Several of those convicted in connection with the robbery served lengthy prison sentences, and portions of the stolen money were never recovered. The robbery prompted significant changes in security procedures for cash transport and storage operations, with companies implementing more sophisticated alarm systems, armed guards, and secure facilities designed to prevent similar thefts. Freddie's publications during his later years extended beyond his initial autobiography to include additional books and contributions to collections about British crime. In 2007, he published Respect, an expanded account of his criminal career, and in 2015, he published The Godfather of British Crime, which provided further details about his activities and perspectives. These publications demonstrated his ongoing ability to market his criminal past to audiences interested in the history of British organized crime, though they also generated criticism from those who argued that criminals should not be allowed to profit from accounts of their illegal activities. Throughout his 80s, Freddie continued to give interviews and make public appearances when his health permitted. His advanced age and his status as one of the last surviving major figures from the Kray era made him an increasingly valuable source for documentary makers and journalists seeking first-hand accounts of that period. However, his health deteriorated steadily, and by the late 2010s, he required nursing care and was reported to be living in reduced circumstances despite his media work. In the aftermath of Freddie's career and that of his generation, British organized crime had transformed into a fundamentally different enterprise. The old territorial firms had been replaced by international criminal networks trafficking drugs, weapons, and people across borders. The codes of conduct and loyalty, which had supposedly governed earlier generations of criminals, had been abandoned in favor of purely profit-driven operations, characterized by extreme violence and by the rapid turnover of participants. Freddie Foreman was something of an enigmatic figure. He grew up in the urban poverty of post-war South London, a place which had been devastated by German bombing during the Blitz and which struggled with endemic deprivation and limited opportunities through the 1940s and 1950s. Moreover, he emerged as a criminal at a time when Britain was experiencing significant social dislocation, when black markets flourished owing to rationing, and when organized crime offered one of the few paths to substantial wealth for working-class men with limited education. Consequently, it is easy to imagine that if Freddie had not become a prominent criminal, somebody else from similar circumstances would have emerged in his place, whether in South London, the East End, or elsewhere in Britain's major cities. It could also be argued that he operated according to a code of conduct which emphasized loyalty to associates, professionalism in criminal operations, and adherence to underworld rules which governed behavior within criminal organizations. Freddie portrayed himself throughout his later years as someone who used violence only when necessary, who maintained loyalty even when doing so placed him at risk, and who treated even victims of his crimes with a degree of respect. He gave interviews in which he emphasized the bonds of loyalty within the firm and his adherence to codes which supposedly distinguish professional criminals from common thugs. In his autobiography and media appearances, he cultivated an image of himself as a product of his time and circumstances, operating within structures which were understood by all participants in organized crime. The reality is far grimmer, though. Freddie Foreman was a murderer who admitted to killing at least 2 people and who was convicted of disposing of a 3rd victim's body. Frank Mitchell was shot on Freddie's participation on Christmas Eve 1966, killed because the Cray twins had decided he posed too great a risk to their organization. Tommy Marks was murdered in retaliation for an attack on Freddie's brother, his body disposed of so thoroughly that it was never recovered. Jack McVitie was stabbed to death at a party, and Freddie ensured that his remains would never be found, depriving his family of the ability to bury him. These were not abstract crimes or unfortunate necessities of criminal life, but deliberate acts of violence which ended lives and devastated families. Moreover, Freddie participated in Britain's largest cash robbery at the time, stealing £6 million, which represented the savings and wages of countless individuals and businesses. His criminal career spanning decades was built on violence, intimidation, and the systematic violation of law. While he later claimed to have followed codes of honor, the reality was that he was willing to kill when ordered to do so by the Cray twins, and willing to kill in revenge when his family was affected. The loyalty he emphasized extended only to fellow criminals, while victims and their families received no consideration. Once British organized crime evolved beyond his era, and his imprisonment ended his active criminal career, Freddie attempted to profit from his violent past through books and media appearances. This transformation of murder into entertainment, this marketing of violence as nostalgic history, represented a final exploitation of the suffering he had caused. The families of his victims received no compensation while he sold accounts of their loved ones' deaths to publishers and documentary makers. Consequently, while Freddie might have claimed that he was simply a professional criminal operating according to underworld codes, the reality was far different. He was a killer and a criminal who inflicted substantial harm over decades, and whose only expressions of remorse came in carefully managed media appearances designed to maintain his public image and generate income. What do you think of Freddie Foreman? Was he the professional criminal with a code of honor he tried to portray himself as? Or was he simply a violent criminal and a killer? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.